Tonight, let's step back into a forgotten chapter of time. Not a single story, but many, whispered through smoke, stone, and the hush that follows the final breath. Some of these lives you've heard of before, some you haven't. But tonight they won't be told as lessons or legends, only as endings, quiet ones that echo like an empty hallway after the door has closed. Each moment, suspended. The way the air felt just before. The sound of footsteps in corridors no one walks now. The flicker of candlelight across someone's cheek as they breathe their last thought. Not in fear, not in glory, just softly, inevitably. This isn't a story of death. Not really. It's a story of how the world feels just after someone leaves it. The stillness that folds around their absence. The dust that settles on the page that will not be turned again. The warmth that lingers where a hand used to rest. So, where are you watching from? What time is it there? Is the room quiet now? Let the weight in your shoulders soften. Let your breath slow. Let the flicker of devices fade into shadow. If you listen closely, the past doesn't speak in shouts. It whispers.
In the lights.
Sink into the quiet and follow me. Through fading footsteps and breathless halls, into the softest corners of history, where endings are remembered not for how they sounded, but for how they felt. We'll begin with a small cup, lifted slowly to cracked lips. As dusk falls over, a Thethi room was quiet in the way that only old rooms could be. The kind built of stone, meant to keep secrets, meant to remember silence. The light that came through the small window was soft and folding, casting long golden slants across the rough floor. In one corner, a clay cup rested on a shallow wooden tray, still warm from the hand that had placed it there. Outside, the sounds of the city carried like a memory. Sandals on worn cobblestones, a merchant's voice somewhere too far to make out the words, the distant sigh of olive trees shifting beneath the weight of late summer. But in here it was still, the kind of stillness that waits, that watches, that listens for a last breath. He sat near the wall, close to the window, the sun brushing over his shoulder like an old friend. His robe, simple and worn, gathered at the waist, its folds settling like the thoughts in his chest. Socrates, not his legend, not his teacher, but as a man with time left only to sit and to feel the hour approaching. He did not look toward the cup, not yet. It sat where it always had to, within reach, but not rushed. There was a weight to this moment that did not belong to fear. His hands, old and ringed with the quiet strength of years, rested gently on his knees. His fingers didn't fidget. His breath, slow and rhythmic, moved like tide water against the shore of time. The hemlock had been prepared without ceremony. No chanting. A robe-clad apothecary with trembling hands. Just a man with a quiet task. Boiling roots, grinding leaves, waiting for the bitterness to settle. Cup steamed faintly, its edges stained with the color of dusk and earth. Plato sat nearby, would later tell the story, but tonight he was only a shadow along the wall. Watching with that same deep hush that filled the room, he wouldn't speak. Not now. There was nothing left to argue. Not when the end had already been agreed upon. It was a strange thing, the way death could feel peaceful when it was invited. Socrates had lived in opposition, questioned in temple courtyards, under colonnades, in the open air of marketplaces. But death, he did not challenge it. He welcomed it like the return of something lost. He finally reached for the cup, not with drama, not with trembling hands, just gently. His fingers curled around the clay like someone picking up the past. The steam touched his face and disappeared. He looked at it for a long moment, as if it held more than liquid, as if the cup itself had watched other hands, other endings. When he drank, it was not a single gulp. He sipped it the way one might sip the first rain after a long, dry season, bitter, sharp, alive with the taste of something final. His throat worked slowly, his eyes closed for a breath, then opened. Nothing changed in the room, not the light, not the sound. Only the feeling. The quiet shifted, deepened. He set the cup back on the tray, and it made the softest sound, the kind you wouldn't notice if your thoughts were louder. But here, in this hush, it echoed like a farewell. They say he spoke just briefly, that his last words were for the gods. that he owed a rooster, a small offering for healing. But in this room, it wasn't what he said that lingered. It was the pause between words, the space between syllables. His feet, they say, began to feel heavy first. The poison worked upward, slow and unrelenting, like a tide drawn by stars that had watched 1,000 such deaths. His body grew still by increments, each breath smaller, each muscle more distant. The light shifted slightly on the wall as the sun moved. Shadows lengthened, curled, reached like fingers toward the man who had always asked questions, now holding none. His chest rose gently, fell again and again. And then it didn't. There was no cry, no shudder, just a quiet exhale, a long one. It's the kind that comes when a burden is set down for the last time. Plato did not weep. He watched. And in the silence that followed, he remembered everything, the words, the laughter, the long walks through dusty streets. But more than that, remembered the way Socrates sat in this final hour, the way death was not something stolen from him, but something he gave. Outside, the sky darkened slowly into the softest blue. Torches were lit in nearby homes. The city kept breathing. But inside that room, time had settled. And in the center of it, the cup remained. Empty now, still warm, still holding the smoke that had risen when the world changed just slightly. And someone very old had finally gone still. The marble steps were worn in the center, where sandals had passed for generations. Rain had smoothed their edges, and dust had gathered in the cracks, as if time itself had been swept into the stone. Somewhere nearby, pigeons stirred lazily along the rooftops, their wings shifting with the weight of a city still wrapped in morning hush. The forum was not yet loud. Not yet. That would come later. For now, Rome was holding its breath. Beneath the stone arches of the Curia, shadows clung to the corners like old gossip. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows, gold and gray, catching the edges of robes and the glint of knives not yet drawn. It was the Aedes, but the word carried no weight here. Not yet. Not for him. He walked slowly through the marble colonnade, his steps firm, his robe brushing across the dust like a ripple across still water. Julius Caesar. But here, not the conqueror, not the orator, not the statue carved in memory. Just a man with tired shoulders, walking toward a place he'd stood 100 times before. He did not pause when the senators turned to greet him. He did not notice the tension behind their eyes. Or if he did, he no longer cared. His face was unreadable, not defiant, not afraid, simply finished. The echo of his sandals was the only sound as he stepped into the chamber. And then a shift. Not sudden, not loud. Just a breath held too long, a shadow where it shouldn't be, a glance that lingered. He turned his head slightly, as if listening to something just behind him. A whisper, a memory, a warning that came too late. And then the movement. Not a roar, not a shout. The first blade was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels wrong, the kind that makes the air go still. It struck just below the shoulder, a flash of heat, then cold. His robe darkened, slowly at first. The second wound came sharper, deeper, a chest-hollowing motion. His hands reached out, but not to defend. Not quite, to hold something steady. To stay upright long enough to understand. The chamber erupted in breathless violence. Not a war cry, not a frenzy, something colder. A ritual more than a rage. He staggered back, caught eyes he had trusted. Cassius, Brutus, his voice did not rise. He did not plead, he did not run. He fell to one knee as another blade found its place. This one lower, twisted with purpose. Blood pooled slowly across the marble. It flowed in elegant curves, tracing the lines of the stone like a map. His hand reached out, grasped the hem of a robe. Let go. There was a sound. Not from him, but from the others. A breath, a wordless sound of something ending. The kind of sound people make when they realize what they've done only after the silence returns. Caesar looked up once more. The light caught in his eyes, not in pain, not even in anger, just recognition. It's like someone remembering something they'd always known would come. And then, the fall. It was not dramatic. It was slow, a folding, a surrender of weight to the earth. His head tilted slightly as it touched the stone, His hand fell open, and then no sound. The senators backed away, slowly. Blades were hidden again beneath folds of cloth, eyes lowered, blood stuck to sandals. No one spoke. The chamber held the moment like a cup holds water. It did not spill. It did not move. The marble beneath him grew darker. Silence settled thicker. Outside, Rome continued. Wagons moved across the stone roads. A child laughed somewhere. But inside, the walls remembered. The very air had changed. They say the statue of Pompey stood watching. The irony, the symmetry, the strange poetry of death. But statues don't speak. The only witness was time. When the servants came, they did not cry out. They moved gently, lifted the body as one might lift a broken clock. Still warm, still heavy with meaning. The robe, once white, now crimson, clung to his frame. The wound near his heart had closed slightly in death, like a mouth going silent. The curia emptied slowly, steps retreating, not rushed, but deliberate, as if guilt had to be walked carefully. The marble was scrubbed, but the stain never truly left. They say that even years later, on certain mornings, when the light was low and the dust caught just right, you could still see where he fell. Julius Caesar. Not in triumph, not on horseback, but on cold stone, under silent arches. As history turned a page, and in that silence, that deep, echoing stillness, something ancient breathed for the last time. The morning was slow to rise. Gray clouds draped low across the sky, their bellies swollen with mist and the memory of rain. Rouen was quiet, too quiet for a city used to voices echoing off stone. But this morning, no bells rang, no markets stirred. Only the sound of wood being stacked in the square. They brought the timber from the far side of town, dry, splintered branches lashed together with ropes already dark from use. The cart creaked as it moved, its wheels heavy with weight, not just of wood, but of purpose. And in the middle of that empty square stood the stake. It had been hammered into the earth just before dawn, its base surrounded by iron shackles, rusted from other uses. Above it, the rising scaffold of kindling reached like dry fingers toward the sky. There was a smell already, smoke from torches still lit, oil rubbed into the fibers of the straw beneath the platform. Behind it all, in a small stone room, Joan waited. Not the saint carved in stained glass, not the legend told in whispers from pulpits, just a girl, young, bond-tired, her hands bound gently in her lap. A simple robe covered her frame, rough fabric coarse against her skin. Her feet were bare. The cell was colder than she expected, damp, the kind of chill that clings not just to skin, but to thought. Her breath rose in little clouds. She sat still, her head tilted slightly, as if listening. There was no sound from beyond the walls, just the steady drip of moisture down the stones. They would come for her soon, she knew. When the door creaked open, she did not flinch. 2 men entered. They did not speak. One held a small cross, the other a torch, its flame low, fluttering in the cold air like a breath about to leave. Joan stood without being told. Her legs trembled slightly beneath her, but she steadied them. Not with pride, not with fury, just resolve. They led her through the corridors slowly. She looked at nothing, not the stones, not the sky beyond the narrow windows. Her eyes were lowered, but open. When she stepped into the square, the crowd shifted. Not a roar, not a cry, just a murmur, the kind that moves like wind through wheat fields. Some wept. Others looked away. A few shouted, but most were quiet, their faces pale, their breath held. The guards escorted her gently, almost as if reluctant. Their hands never pulled, only guided. They placed her near the base of the stake and stepped back. A priest approached. He spoke, but his voice was distant, thin, as if the wind had taken half of it away. He offered the cross. She kissed it. Not with drama, not with ceremony, just softly. The ropes first, wrapped around her waist, her arms, her ankles, tight but not cruel, meant to hold, not hurt. Her hair cropped short now, stirred in the breeze. The sky above her was flat and colorless. The crowd shifted again. Children were pulled closer to mothers. Men lowered their hoods. The first torch touched the base of the wood. It crackled. The scent of oil caught, sharp and sudden. She looked upward. Her lips moved. Not a scream, not a protest. A prayer, perhaps, or maybe a memory. No one could hear the words. The fire spread slowly at first, licking the edges of the dry branches, curling toward her feet, and then the smoke came. It didn't rise, not right away. It circled, coiled, moved like a living thing. It wrapped around her legs, crawled up her arms. Joan did not cry out. Her eyes remained open. Fixed on something only she could see, the flames grew. They reached her robe. The fabric blackened, cracked. The air grew thick with heat and still. She stood. The crowd began to tremble. Some turned away. Some fell to their knees. And then the wind shifted, just enough to carry the smoke across the faces of the watching crowd. And in that moment, all sound faded. There was only flame. And in the heart of it, a girl. No crown, no sword, no armor, just skin and ash. They say her last word was Jesus. They say the fire did not touch her face until the very end. They say she did not scream. When it was done, the silence that followed was not relief. It was weight as the ashes were gathered, scattered, lost. But some say the smell lingered for days, that the stones in the square stayed warm, that no birds landed there until the snow came. Joan of Arc, not the warrior, not the saint, just the girl in the fire. And in the morning was slow to rise. Gray clouds draped low across the sky, their bellies swollen with mist in the memory of rain. Ruang was quiet, too quiet for a city used to voices echoing off stone. But this morning no bells rang. No market stirred. Only the sound of wood being stacked in the square. They brought the timber from the far side of town. Dry, splintered branches lashed together with ropes already dark from use. The cart creaked as it moved, its wheels heavy with weight, not just of wood, but of purpose. And in the middle of that empty square stood the stake. It had been hammered into the earth just before dawn, its base surrounded by iron shackles, rusted from other uses. Above it, the rising scaffold of kindling reached like dry fingers toward the sky. There was a smell already, smoke from torches still lit, oil rubbed into the fibers of the straw beneath the platform. Behind it all, in a small stone room, Joan waited. Not the saint carved in stained glass, not the legend told in whispers from pulpits, just a girl, young, bond-tired, her hands bound gently in her lap. A simple robe covered her frame, rough fabric coarse against her skin. Her feet were bare. The cell was colder than she expected, damp, the kind of chill that clings not just to skin, but to thought. Her breath rose in little clouds. She sat still, her head tilted slightly, as if listening. There was no sound from beyond the walls, just the steady drip of moisture down the stones. They would come for her soon, she knew. When the door creaked open, she did not flinch. 2 men entered. They did not speak. One held a small cross, the other a torch, its flame low, fluttering in the cold air like a breath about to leave. Joan stood without being told. Her legs trembled slightly beneath her, but she steadied them. Not with pride, not with fury, just resolve. They led her through the corridor slowly. She looked at nothing, not the stones, not the sky beyond the narrow windows. Her eyes were lowered, but open. When she stepped into the square, the crowd shifted. Not a roar, not a cry, just a murmur, the kind that moves like wind through wheat fields. Some wept, others looked away, a few shouted. But most were quiet, their faces pale, their breath held. The guards escorted her gently, almost as if reluctant. Their hands never pulled, only guided. They placed her near the base of the stake and stepped back. A priest approached. He spoke, but his voice was distant, thin, as if the wind had taken half of it away. He offered the cross. She kissed it. Not with drama, not with ceremony. Just softly, and they began. The ropes first, wrapped around her waist, her arms, her ankles, tight but not cruel, meant to hold, not hurt. Her hair cropped short now, stirred in the breeze. The sky above her was flat and colorless. The crowd shifted again. Children were pulled closer to mothers. Men lowered their hoods. The first torch touched the base of the wood. It crackled. The scent of oil caught, sharp and sudden. She looked upward. Her lips moved. Not a scream, not a protest. A prayer, perhaps, or maybe a memory. No one could hear the words. The fire spread slowly at first, licking the edges of the dry branches, curling toward her feet. And then the smoke came. Didn't rise. Not right away. Circled, coiled, moved like a living thing. It wrapped around her legs, crawled up her arms. Joan did not cry out. Her eyes remained open, fixed on something only she could see. The flames grew. They reached her robe. The fabric blackened, cracked. The air grew thick with heat, and still. She stood. The crowd began to tremble. Some turned away. Some fell to their knees. And then the wind shifted, just enough to carry the smoke across the faces of the watching crowd. And in that moment, all sound faded. There was only flame. And in the heart of it, a girl. No crown, no sword, no armor, just skin and ash. They say her last word was Jesus. They say the fire did not touch her face until the very end. They say she did not scream. When it was done, the silence that followed was not relief. It was weight. The ashes were gathered, scattered, lost. But some say the smell lingered for days. The stones in the square stayed warm. That no birds landed there until the snow came. Joan of Arc. Not the warrior, not the saint, just the girl in the fire. And in the smoke that rose above Rouen, history closed its eyes. Remembered. The smoke that rose above Rouen. History closed its eyes and remembered. The tower was still before dawn. Not silent, not quite, but holding its breath, as if the stone itself knew what day it was. What hour? The walls, old and damp with centuries, seemed to lean inward, their cold breath curling through corridors where guards stood without speaking. Outside, the grass was wet with dew. Each blade glimmered under the pale sky, the kind of light that comes just before the sun, but after the stars have given up. There were no birds singing. Even the Thames moved slower this morning, its current thick with mist. Inside her chamber, Anne sat near the window. Her hands were folded in her lap, resting lightly. Her fingers trembled now and then, like leaves touched by a wind no one could feel. Nightdress had been exchanged for a simple gown, gray, modest, tied at the waist with a ribbon frayed at the edges. Her hair was tucked beneath a white cloth wrapped tightly as if to hold her thoughts in place. The room smelled of lavender water. Someone had left a small bowl of it near the cot. The scent barely masked the dampness of the stone. She had slept little. When her eyes closed, her mind would not follow. Thoughts circled like moths to flame. Her daughter, her coronation, her music, the echo of her own laughter in a court that had once adored her. She did not weep. Not this morning. Her tears had run dry in the dark hours before. What remained was something quieter, not peace, but acceptance. When they came for her, they knocked only once. She turned to the door before it opened. 2 women entered. One carried a small silver cross. The other held nothing at all. Behind them, the constable. He did not speak at first. He bowed his head, then raised it slowly, meeting her eyes not as an officer, but as a man who did not know what to say. She stood without help. Her feet were bare. She crossed the chamber slowly, the hem of her gown whispering across the stone. She nodded once to the women who flanked her with quiet grace. Together, they walked the path down. Through narrow halls, past heavy doors, into open air. The morning greeted her with a breath of wind, soft, almost warm. The sky was the color of pale cream, just beginning to blue at the edges. The scaffold had been built near the lawn. Not high, not grand, just a flat square of wood, clean and freshly swept. The axe was not there, not yet, only the straw laid neatly. A small crowd had gathered, though not one voice rose. No shouting, no protest, just stillness. A rustle of cloth, cough quickly muffled. Anne's eyes found the sky. She lingered there. A cloud drifted above, slow and wide, like a sail on a distant sea. She stepped up onto the platform. The wood creaked gently under her weight. The executioner stood nearby. He was not English. She had requested a French sword, a clean stroke. He wore a dark tunic, his face unreadable. His blade, not yet drawn, rested beneath a cloth. She turned to the small crowd, spoke softly. Her words lost in the wind to most, but those closest said her voice did not waver. She forgave. She prayed. She said she died the queen's true subject, and then she smiled, faint, brief, like the echo of something remembered. The women stepped forward, removed the cloth from her hair, bound her eyes gently with linen. Her lips moved once more, soundless now, as though offering something final to the sky. She knelt. The ground was damp beneath her knees. Her hands folded, her chin lifted slightly. The ribbon at her waist fluttered once in the breeze. The sword was drawn without sound. And then, no scream, no cry. Just the whisper of steel through morning air. The silence that followed was not hollow. It was full of every breath not taken, every word not said, every heartbeat held back in awe. The women stepped forward, covered her. The executioner bowed, and the wind passed over the scaffold like a sigh. They say the birds returned by noon. The grass did not grow there for years, but the tower never felt quite the same again. Anne Boleyn, not the temptress, not the scandal, not the queen. Just shutters creaked faintly as the wind moved across the hills of Arcetri. Cypress trees stood like sentinels in the distance, their dark silhouettes unmoving beneath a sky that no longer shimmered the way it used to. The villa, tucked just beyond the monastery walls, breathed with the weight of memory and quiet. Its rooms filled with dust and time, and the whisper of pages turning in the dark. Galileo sat in a high-backed chair near the window. His hands rested lightly on the arms, the fingers curled not in tension, but in the soft ache of age. The robe he wore had frayed along the cuffs, worn smooth where he had folded and refolded it over years of long, slow nights. He blinked often now. The world was dim, even when the candles burned bright. He could no longer see the stars. Not fully. Not like before. Not like those nights when the heavens seemed alive with movement, with proof. When Jupiter's moons turned like clockwork, when Saturn's rings floated like threads in a dark sea. But now, the sky was only shape and shadow. Blindness had come slowly, like a tide rising in the corners of his vision. First one eye, then the other. First the blur, then the dark. The lenses could no longer help. Not his, not anyone's. It had been years since he'd traced the stars with his own sight. Now he held them in memory. He breathed shallowly, as though each breath had to be borrowed from silence. The room smelled faintly of ink and old wax, of the faint bitterness of wood smoke, of the garden just outside where rosemary grew wild along the wall. Someone had lit a fire earlier, but it had burned down now. The warmth had drifted away, leaving only the faint glow of coals, red as Mars, dull as the end of a long season. A servant brought broth in a small ceramic bowl. Galileo nodded his thanks but did not lift it. His appetite had waned in recent days. He listened more than he spoke now. The world came to him through sound, the scrape of shoes on terracotta tile, the call of birds at dusk, the rustle of papers in the corner where his last student worked by candlelight. He did not fear death. That had passed years ago. The fear, the shame, the trial, all of it swallowed by time. Even the words per, see, mauve. Even that stubborn whisper had faded into memory. Tonight the sky was clear, they said, the air sharp with frost, the stars so sharp you could cut your finger on Orion's belt, but he could only feel it, not see. He turned his face to the window. Chill of the glass touched his cheek. His breath clouded faintly on the pane. Somewhere out there, the planets moved on, the same as they always had. They did not pause for men, not even for the ones who named them, mapped them, questioned them. He thought of his daughter, the letters, her voice, the softness of her hands when they last embraced, years ago, beneath the olive trees. She had left too soon. The world had taken her too quietly. But he felt her now, sometimes when the wind moved just right. His pulse was slow, faint, a clock winding down not with a tick, but with the hush that comes after the chime. He reached toward the small table beside him, his hand brushing the edge of a worn book. He did not open it. He only rested his palm on the cover, as if the pages inside could still whisper something to him. The candle flickered. Its light tilted and righted itself again. A moth fluttered against the glass. The world breathed in and out. His head tilted slightly, not in sleep, not in pain, just in stillness. His final thought may have been of motion, of the stars swinging above Florence, of moons rising over salt water, of Saturn's curve against the velvet black, or perhaps it was of silence, the kind of silence that follows discovery, that holds wonder. He did not speak. His hands loosened gently in his lap. His chest rose once, then stilled, and the stars, though he could not see them, turned still. Somewhere, a clock chimed softly, far off in the dark. Galileo Galilei. Not the heretic, not the rebel, it's just the man in the chair, with the sky behind his eyes. And night folding around him like a forgotten prayer. A woman who knelt in the morning air and did not flinch. The arches loomed in the early light, cracked and hollowed by centuries of wind. Their once golden stone now softened to a gentle ochre gray. Vines had found their way into the seams, curling along the old scaffolding. Breathing in the silence where once the air had shaken with voices. The Colosseum did not stir. It hadn't for ages, but the bones of it remembered, not in sound, in weight, in dust, in the way sunlight fell across the sand of the arena floor. The same angle it had always known, unchanged by the years. This morning the stands were empty. The wind drifted lazily through the corridors, carrying the faint scent of stone and earth and a time long past. A bird called from somewhere high in the broken tiers. No reply came. But once, it had been different. The candle had burned itself out. The page was cool to the touch. The monk's face, peaceful, day, buried him beneath the chapel garden, beneath the rosemary and thyme that had long since overtaken the stones. No name marked the spot, only the sound of wind through leaves. But some nights when the bell tolls early before lauds, the monks say they feel something stir in the scriptorium. A hush within the hush, as though someone were still sitting in the corner, waiting to finish the final line, not to speak it, only to write it. Unfelt. The air was thick with incense, drifting in slow curls through the lattice of a gilded chamber, where silence had begun to settle like dust. Beyond the tall, reed-covered windows, Alexandria was beginning to darken, the sky above the palace sinking into an amber that promised neither peace nor storm, only finality. The pillars of the room were wrapped in silk, pale and perfumed, their folds heavy with heat. It had been quiet in the palace for days now, though the sea still whispered at the shore beyond the courtyard, and the soldiers' sandals clicked distantly in corridors that no longer welcomed their rhythm. Cleopatra lay reclined on a low couch beside a bronze lamp that sputtered now and then as the oil burned thin. Her eyes, dark and dry, watched the movement of a lizard across the far wall. Tiny feet made no sound. It moved like time. Her hair had been arranged that morning with care, braided and pinned, strands of gold woven through the dark coils. Not out of vanity, but ritual. She had been born into a world of ceremony, and even now, in these last soft hours, the shapes of ritual felt like something solid, something that might hold her body still while her mind drifted elsewhere. She wore linen, not the royal robe, not the gold-threaded gown of her triumphs, just linen, soft and almost sheer in the fading light. Her hands rested in her lap, one atop the other. No jewels clung to her fingers. There were voices in the hallway, low, uncertain, like birds calling from within a cage. Her maids moved quietly, shadows more than women. They brought no food, no wine. She did not look at it, not yet. The chamber smelled of myrrh and crushed rose petals. There were no scrolls left unrolled, no messages to dictate, no mirrors set out. Only silence. Mark Antony had died days before. She had been told the way he fell, leaning against the wall of the mausoleum, calling her name even as the blood slipped through his fingers. She had not cried. Not then, not even when she pulled him into her arms, not even when he died. There was no room left for tears. She had tried once to reason with the coming world, but Rome did not listen to women, especially not ones who ruled. So now she waited. The basket stirred faintly. A whisper of motion beneath the cloth. She reached for it slowly, carefully, as if lifting memory. Her fingers undid the knot, peeled back the fabric. Inside, nestled among figs and fragrant leaves, the asp lay coiled, beautiful, quiet. Its scales shimmered like bronze. She did not recoil. Instead, she sat straighter, drew in a breath. Her maidservants knelt beside her, heads bowed. One held a shallow bowl of warm wine, the other a comb. Not for use, only for holding. Cleopatra took the snake in her hands, did not hiss, did not strike. She pressed it gently against the curve of her arm. A small bite, barely a pinch, and then warmth. A warmth that spread not like fire, but like sleep. Her eyes closed just once. She leaned back into the cushions, her head tilting slightly. The snake fell softly from her fingers to the floor, curled in on itself. She did not shudder. Her breath simply slowed, and then stopped. The lamp beside her flickered once more, and then steadied. Outside, the sea moved as it always had, drawn by moonlight, blind to empires, deaf to the weight of gold. The soldiers would arrive soon. They would find her still, draped in linen, her lips pale, her hands folded in the quiet curve of her lap. They would speak her name, but it would not return to them. She was already elsewhere, not in Rome, not in history, but in the breath between moments, where kingdoms fall softly, and queens choose when to leave. The tent was quiet, heavy with the scent of sweat and smoke, horsehair and leather. Its curved frame, wrapped in thick felt and stitched hide, bowed gently in the wind that moved across the steppe, a wind that had known him since birth, and now waited for his breath to leave it. The sky outside was deep with twilight. No stars yet. It's only a smear of dark blue across the horizon, stretching low and endless beyond the flickering torches. The camp had gone still. Men sat around fires without speaking. The horses stood silent, their breath clouding into the air like prayers without voices. Inside, the walls of the gur were lined with patterned cloth, the colors dimmed by years of sun and dust. Weapons had been removed. Nothing sharp remained. only bowls of cooling broth, folded furs, and the weight of what came next. He lay upon a mat layered with hides. Deer, bear, and wolf. Their warmth, once hunted, once worn in triumph, now held him like earth. His chest rose slowly, too slowly. The movement faint, as if his body were already part of the land, Genghis Khan. But not the one from battle songs or empire maps. Not the storm riding across rivers and mountains. Here, only a man, flesh and breath, worn thin. His beard was streaked with white, his face lined not by age alone, but by years of weather, by grit and wind and the burden of seeing more than one lifetime should. His hands rested at his sides, scarred, dry, wide as a warrior's, now curled loosely as a child's. A healer knelt nearby, not touching, just watching, listening to the gaps between breaths. They had tried everything: boiled roots, warm milk, sacred chants, even silence. But death, like any other enemy, could not be bribed, only honored. Outside the flap, warriors waited. They did not speak his name. To speak it now would be to summon loss. The wind rattled the edges of the tent, a soft sound, like fingers brushing a drumskin. He turned his head slightly. No effort, no pain, just a small motion, a glance to the ceiling, where shadows gathered in a pattern that resembled smoke from old fires. His eyes no longer blinked often. They had seen the desert rise, the cities fall, the rivers red and clear and dry. They had watched stars chart the path to the ocean and back. And now they stared into nothing. Not with fear, not even with peace, but with recognition. As if he had been here before, his lips parted dry. A single word may have escaped them. The name of a horse, a daughter, a river near his boyhood tent. No one could hear it. The air inside the ger grew heavier. Smoke from the brazier curled upward, then twisted, then stopped. One more breath, a small one, and then stillness. The kind that came not from defeat, but from completion. The kind that echoed beneath ribs and mountains. He did not groan, did not grip the hides. He simply stopped. They waited outside for the candle to be extinguished. A quiet signal. The warriors bowed their heads, one by one. No wail rose, no horn sounded. His death was a secret kept from the world for weeks, a custom older than the empire itself. His body would be hidden. His grave would never be marked. But the land knew. The steppe whispered his name into the tall grass. The wind carried it west, to the edge of rivers. The horses shifted, restless for a master whose scent still clung to saddle and soil. And somewhere far from camp, beneath the wide sky, a storm began to gather. Not in fury, but in reverence. Genghis Khan, not the conqueror, not the myth, just the man in the tent. Wrapped in hides, remembered by earth, taken by silence. The garden was still. The kind of stillness that lived only at the edge of evening, when the last light rested against stone and silence folded itself around the trees. The maple leaves had just begun to fall, drifting slowly across the courtyard, their edges the color of flame. Some had gathered around the stepping stones. Others floated gently in the koi pond, where the water barely moved. A low breeze passed through the bamboo, making no sound, only motion. Like a breath remembered. The house behind the garden was open, its paper screens drawn aside to let in the fading sun. Inside, all was in order. Tatami mat swept. The scroll hung precisely in its alcove. Black ink on pale silk, single word brushed in one stroke. Honor. He sat at the edge of the platform, his legs folded beneath him, his posture straight and still. His hands rested in his lap, cradling a small cup of sake. The steam had long since cooled, not drunk. He only held it, the warmth of it, sinking slowly into his palms. His robe was immaculate, indigo. The crests of his family stitched in silver at the shoulders. Beneath it, the white underlayer pressed smooth against his skin. His hair had been tied with care, not by a servant, but by his own hands, steady even in the weight of this hour. He watched the light move across the stones. Watched as a crane passed overhead, its wings outstretched, silent against the burning sky. He did not look away. The sun was beginning to drop behind the wall. The shadow of the pine tree reached longer across the moss, and still he did not move. Not until he heard the soft step behind him, his second, a man he had chosen, a man he trusted. The second knelt, silent. The sword wrapped in black silk rested beside him, its blade sharpened not for battle, but for mercy. The samurai nodded once, a movement smaller than breath, and the second bowed his head in return. There was no rush, no tension, only stillness, the kind that came from certainty. He reached for the short blade. The tantu had been placed carefully on a lacquered tray. It gleamed dully in the warm light. He took it with both hands, raising it to his chest in reverence, not for the act, but for the life that had led to it, for the name, for the line of ancestors watching, not in judgment, but in witness. He had failed, not in cowardice, but in duty. The castle had fallen, the message had arrived too late. Though his lord had forgiven him, the path was already clear. He bared his abdomen. The wind quieted, as if the trees had stopped to watch. And then, with a breath drawn from the very center of himself, he moved. The blade was clean, precise. A horizontal stroke, low and deep. His eyes did not close. His teeth did not clench. His second waited. He never cried out, never faltered. And when the time came, the final moment, the second moved like wind. One motion, one release, the blade fell. The head tilted gently forward and was caught, not in brutality, but in grace. The body slumped softly against the ground. The robe darkened, the leaves continued to fall, and the sun disappeared. They washed his body with warm water, dressed him again in the same robes, brushed his hair one last time, and laid him facing the western sky. He was buried not in a temple, but beneath the maple tree, where the leaves would fall each year, where the wind would remember. A samurai, not in battle, not in vengeance, just a man, at peace, beneath a crimson sky, his final breath still warm in the courtyard air. The corridor was narrow, its stone walls wrapped in shadows that smelled faintly of damp wood and lavender oil. Somewhere beyond the shutters, a wind stirred against the thick English fog, brushing past the windows of Futhering Castle like a hand pressed gently against glass. It was early, not yet dawn, but the air held the stillness of something final, waiting. She stood in her chamber, already dressed. The dark velvet gown fell heavy against her frame, the fabric worn soft at the sleeves from years of clasped hands and folded prayers. Crimson, they had asked. Red for martyrdom. She had chosen it herself. The underdress glowed through in places where the outer layer shifted, a color not of defiance but of closure. Two women tended to her quietly. They did not cry. One held a crucifix, small and dark with wear. The other a handkerchief folded many times into itself. Mary stood tall beneath their hands. Her shoulders straightened each time the weight of the moment tried to press them down. The hair beneath her veil had silvered at the edges. Her eyes were calm, not wide with fear, not hollow with resignation, only calm. A queen's calm. It's the kind that comes not from power, but from long hours spent losing it. Bit by bit, they brought her a small book, the psalter she had carried for years, the pages creased, corners softened by hours of touch. She read from it aloud, softly, her voice low, carried not with strength, but with stillness. Each word like a stone placed gently in a quiet river. When the knock came, she did not startle. She closed the book, touched her hand to the crucifix, nodded. The guards did not look her in the eye. She passed between them slowly, her steps silent on the old wooden planks. They led her down the stair, the chill seeping up through the soles of her shoes. The chamber where it would happen was already filled. A low platform had been built for her to stand upon. It creaked beneath the weight of expectation. The block stood at the center, clean, polished, quiet as stone could be. The headsman waited in the corner. His axe sharpened the night before, blade wrapped in cloth. He wore black. His hands trembled faintly at his sides. She stepped into the room, and something in the air shifted. The hush deepened. No one spoke. Mary looked to the crowd, men in fine collars, others with pens and pages ready. No friendly eyes, no kin, but she did not lower her gaze. Instead, she knelt and prayed, her words clearer now. They rose into the vaulted ceiling, floating just long enough to remind the walls that once she had ruled. She forgave the queen who had signed the order. She forgave the man who held the blade. She forgave the world, and then she stood again. She removed her outer gown with care, folding it with her own hands. Beneath she wore scarlet, not bright, not rich, but deep and warm, like embers left in the hearth of a childhood long gone. She took the blindfold herself, tied it carefully, fingers steady. No one moved to help her, not from cruelty, but from awe. She knelt at the block, her hands before her, the crucifix between her fingers, her voice one last time, in Manus Tua's Domini. Into thy hands, O Lord. And then the blade. The first strike landed not perfectly. Her body tensed, not in pain, in instinct. But no sound escaped her lips. The second stroke ended it. The hush afterward was thick. No one exhaled. No one moved. The blood slipped slowly from the block, quiet as ink soaking into parchment. Her body was lifted with reverence, covered in linen. The crucifix placed back into her hands, where they cooled gently. Later, they burned her clothes, buried her in secrecy. But the story would rise like incense, unfolded across years in whispers and songs, not of rebellion, not even of politics, but of a woman who chose to die like fire. Mary, Queen of Scots, not the exile, not the prisoner, just a woman dressed in red, reading from a psalter, walking toward her end not with fear, but with flam. The room was small, barely wide enough for the narrow bed and the small wooden chair beside it. The walls had once been white, but had yellowed in places where sunlight brushed the paint too often. A single window looked out onto a field, a pale swath of wheat now dry with summer, stretching toward a sky the color of milk and thunder. It was evening. The air held the hush of heat cooling at last, and the cicadas had gone quiet for a while, as if even they knew that something had slowed inside the house. He sat near the window, elbows resting on the sill, fingers loosely wrapped around a brush that hadn't touched canvas in days. His shirt clung to his frame, the fabric marked by smudges of oil and sweat, and his straw hat lay forgotten at the foot of the bed. Vincent, not the genius, not the tragedy, just a man trying to hold the world still long enough to understand. The field outside rolled softly in the wind. He watched it the way one watches their own breath, not with wonder, but with a strange kind of gratitude. The colors out there were already in his mind: gold ochre, bruised violet where the sky met the edge of the land. There was a canvas against the wall, unfinished, its edges raw. A house with red eaves, a patch of wild grass, skies so wide it looked like it might fall. He hadn't touched it since the morning. The sun had been too strong then, the world too loud. His fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear. From where? The letter lay open on the table, scrawled in his own hand, ink smeared at the corners, words overlapping. Something between goodbye and explanation. There was no sound in the room, except the brush of wind through the cracked window pane. No voices. Not today. The landlord's wife had passed the door once earlier, but her footsteps had gone on without stopping. His body ached, a familiar ache, the kind that settled deep into the spine and whispered things no one else could. Here, the kind that blurred the difference between morning and night, between one breath and the next. He looked down at his hand. The paint still under his nails. The trembling had grown worse. He reached into the drawer, not rushed, not shaking, just ready. The pistol felt heavier than it should, not cold, just certain. He stood, crossed the room, one step, then another. The floorboards creaked softly. He left the brush behind, left the letter where it was, left the painting unfinished. Outside, the sun had lowered behind the trees, casting long shadows over the wheat. We walked through it, the tall stalks parting around him like water. The field held the warmth of the day rising in slow waves against his skin. At the edge, he paused, listened to the hum of the land, the soft chirp of a sparrow, the far-off bark of a dog that did not belong to anyone he knew. He closed his eyes, not to disappear, but to remember. The cypress trees, the chapel, all the bedroom in Arles, the swirl of stars, and then a single shot muffled by the grain. The field fell still again. He did not fall right away. He stumbled first, held his side, sank to his knees. The wheat bowed with him. The sky watched. The wind stopped. He lay back, his breath short, not panicked, not afraid, only quiet. 2 days later, he would die in his bed, Theo at his side, holding his hand in silence. They would not speak of the field or the pain, only of light and color, and the way the stars had looked from the hospital window. Vincent van Gogh. Not mad, not misunderstood, just a man who painted everything he saw. Even as it slipped away, and in the quiet where the brush met canvas, he left something behind that never stopped breathing. In her chest. The candle burned low, its light trembling across the folds of parchment that lay scattered on the small desk near the foot of the bed. Shadows of notes danced against the wall, lines curving like breath. Over the page, unfinished, yet pulsing with something alive. Ink had dried where the pen had been dropped. A bar of music left open, waiting for what would never come. The room was close, thick with the scent of sweat, wool, and oil. The windows had been shut tight against the December chill, but the cold found its way in anyway, threading its fingers along the floorboards. Up the legs of the bed, into the corners where his coat still hung, long untouched. Wolfgang lay beneath. The blankets, his breathing shallow, fragile, each inhaled a little shorter than the last. The sheets were tucked neatly around him, though one had slipped down along his collarbone, exposing a shoulder now too thin, too pale, too still. The requiem sat open beside him, notes and staves, corrections in the margins, spurs in ink. He had been composing from the bed in recent days, his hand growing weaker, his thoughts clearer, each note like a final breath, not of fear, of urgency, of something needing to be said before time ran out. His eyes were closed now, but not in sleep. He was listening, always listening. The room around him faded. Inside his mind, music bloomed still, strings low and slow, quiet swell, then woodwinds, gentle, like wind through chapel arches. A single violin note, held so delicately it almost broke apart. He saw the choir before he heard them, faceless robes the color of fog. Their voices lifted from within him, not above. He heard them the way he once heard rain, through a cracked door on a still afternoon. There was no movement from the bed, no shift of limbs, only the faint rise and fall of breath beneath the blanket. Constanza sat nearby, her fingers folded around his. She said nothing. She only watched and waited, and tried not to remember how he used to laugh that loud, possible laugh that filled halls, cracked through formality. Spilled wine. The light in his eyes had dimmed, but the quiet behind them still shimmered with melody. He mouthed something. A rhythm, or maybe a phrase. She leaned closer. He was humming. Faint, barely audible. A single line, a final measure. One last note, then silence. His fingers loosened. His chest did not rise again. The candle flickered once, stilled, no fanfare. No sudden cold, just quiet. The room waited. The requiem, still unfinished, lay open to the page where he had stopped the lacrimosa. A prayer for the weeping. A line of mourning he never completed, but even in its pause, the music lingered. They would say he was too young, that he left too soon, that genius should not be fragile, but genius had always been fragile, like sound, like light, like life. Wolfgang Amadeus, Mozart, not the child prodigy, not the court composer, just a man in a quiet room, listening for something only he could hear. And as the candlelight faded, the silence did not feel empty. It felt full, as though the music had chosen to rest. The wind moved low across the sand, soft and steady, brushing the dunes with hands made of time. It did not howl. It did not rise. It whispered the way the desert always had in layers, one over the next. Memory over silence, grain over grain. There was no road, only tracks, barely visible, already beginning to disappear behind the wheels of the motorcycle that had stopped at the edge of a bend, tires pressed into the earth as if reluctant to move further, their treads filling slowly with dust. The sky above was a pale, endless gray, the kind of sky that tells you nothing, neither storm nor peace, just. Winnie stood beside the machine, his coat unbuttoned, hair lifted gently by the breeze, eyes hidden behind goggles smudged with sand and sweat. He pulled off the leather gloves one by one. His hands bore the history of too many letters and too many weapons. Hands th. But Dorset wasn't Arabia. The sands here were soft with moss, like the road, a narrow path between hedges. But the silence was the same. He had come back a different man, smaller in some ways, not in spirit, but in presence. The parts of him that had belonged to legend had stayed behind, buried beneath date palms and broken promises. The engine of the brow. Superior still ticked faintly, cooling. The scent of oil clung to his coat. He wiped a smear of dust from the tank with the edge of his sleeve. A simple act, domestic. Human, his mind drifted to the desert winds, to the open tents and endless sky, to the feeling of riding a horse over sunlit ridges where sound disappeared and the world seemed untouched by time. He remembered the men, the ones who had followed him without asking, the ones who had died believing he was something more than flesh, the ones who had been left behind. He had always carried them, quietly beneath his uniform, beneath the words, beneath the silence. He wore like a second skin, a bird startled from the hedgerow. Its wings flashed once, and then it was gone. He turned back toward the machine, mounted it. The leather seat creaked under his weight. He adjusted the goggles, leaned forward, pressed the engine to life. The road curved ahead, soft bend, a slope. He did not see the boy with the bicycle, not until it was too late. There was no sound, only the hush of tires, the screech of turning, and then the impact. The world tilted. He flew from the seat. The sky flipped. The earth rose, a moment suspended in air, and then stillness. His body crumpled against the grass, limbs bent unnaturally, coat twisted, blood soaking slowly into the soil. The motorcycle lay several meters away, steaming. The boy ran for help. Voices came. The quiet was broken. But not for him. They carried him gently, tried to wake him. Whispered his name, not the name they gave him, but the name he had made into myth. Lawrence of Arabia. But he did not stir. His breath slowed. Faint then. The none at all. The doctor would say it was the head. A blow too sudden. Too deep, but the desert would say he had never truly returned, that he had always belonged to the dust, to the wind, the places where maps lose meaning and only sky remains. T.E. Lawrence, not the hero, not the spy, just a man who once crossed endless sands, and in the end was taken quietly, not by a war, but by the turn of a road. The canvas of the tent bowed gently in the wind. It seemed strained, but unbroken. The surface dusted in white where frost had formed overnight. Outside there was only ice flat, vast and endlessly still.
Ice.
The horizon had disappeared days ago, swallowed by the storm, by the cold, by a sky so pale it seemed to hang just inches above the earth. Inside, the light was dim. Filtered through the snow-laced fabric, it painted everything in a soft, gray hush. The breath of the men inside rose faintly with each exhale, curled upward, and vanished. Captain Robert Falcon Scott lay wrapped in his sleeping bag, his back gently resting against a folded pack, the canvas cold against his shoulders. His eyes were half closed, not in sleep, but in waiting. Not the kind of waiting that paces or worries, the other kind, still kind. He had written in his journal that morning. A few lines, the pencil trembling in his hand, the words pressed carefully into the paper. His thoughts had slowed, but his will had not. He wrote not to survive, but to be remembered. Beside him, Wilson and Bowers lay in silence, already long gone. Their forms curled into stillness, their features softened. By days of cold, they had stopped stirring sometime in the night, or the night before. The days were no longer separate, no light, no sun, only the wind outside. It howled occasionally, but not with violence, the emptiness. The food had been gone for days. Oil, too. The small stove at the center of the tent sat silent, black with soot, cold as the air that drifted in through seams too thin to keep out time. The final rations had been divided, then halved again. The last chocolate shared without ceremony. A single square melting slowly on the tongue. He tried to move his fingers. They responded, but barely. Each motion distant, as though made through water. The cold had crept up from his toes, past his knees, now heavy in his chest. But it was not pain anymore, just weight. He thought of Kathleen. Her hands. The quiet smile she gave him each time he left, never knowing whether she'd see him return. He thought of England. Of the ship. Of the way the sails once caught the wind at Plymouth. Sound. He did not think of failure. Not now. The journey had been everything. The steps across the ice. The flag planted. The photographs. The promise kept. Even if the price had grown too great to bear. The tent walls rustled. Snow dust fell from the top in a soft shower. He did not look up. He only listened. To the last. Sound, the snow. The endless hush. His body was growing heavier, his limbs slower, his breath shorter. He reached out once, not for help, but to feel the fabric, to know he was still here. The cold kissed his face like a mother saying goodbye. He blinked once, and then. Stillness. There was no witness. No record of the exact moment. Only his journal. The last line, scrawled and fading. For God's sake, look after our people. And then no more. The tent remained upright, its shape soft beneath the falling snow. The drifts gathered slowly, gently. No avalanche, no roar, just the patient layering of silence. They would find him months later. The tent buried, the bodies carefully laid, the journal tucked beside him. But long before that, the earth had already begun to take him, to hold him. Scott of the Antarctic, not the conqueror of the pole, not the frozen martyr, just a man, lying. Beside his companions, beneath a sky that had not changed, letting go into the deepest quiet the world could offer. The morning sky was wide and blue, almost to still, the kind of stillness that comes before a sound is lost forever. Far beneath her, the Pacific shimmered, like silk brushed with silver. The clouds hung in delicate strands, thin and far apart, offering no shelter and no clue of distance. From up here, there were no borders, no signs, no hands to point the way. Only the endless hush of wind and engine and sky. Inside the cockpit, Amelia sat forward, her gloved hands resting gently on the controls. The sun glinted off her goggles, casting small reflections onto the glass before her. Her leather cap clung snugly to her head, soft with wear, worn it on so many flights, through rainstorms and applause, cross continents and whispers. The radio hissed quietly beside. Her, a thin, scratchy voice trying to form itself from miles away. She leaned closer, adjusted the dial with a slow turn. Her voice followed, steady, clipped, tired. We are running north and south. Silence. The air around her was dry, the kind of dry that tastes like metal and memory. She hadn't spoken much in the last hour, hadn't needed to. Her mind moved in calculations now. Degrees, gallons, miles. Where was Howland? The map in her lap fluttered gently. She pressed it down with one hand, though she no longer needed. She had traced the lines so many times in her mind, they might as well have been etched behind her eyes. Fred Noonan sat beside her, quiet, focused. His pencil moved lightly across his notebook, the pages catching the sunlight in soft flares. His jaw was tight, not in fear. In purpose, the sky did not change. The clouds remained soft, scattered, meaningless. Amelia blinked against the glare, eyes aching from hours of scanning the horizon. The engines purred beneath her, a steady heartbeat, faithful and rhythmic. But even that sound had begun to stretch. To blend into the quiet behind it, she reached for a sip of water. Lukewarm, the bottle lighter than she remembered. A thought passed through her, not fear, but recognition. The kind that comes when you realize you've been alone for longer than you thought. She pressed the radio again. We must be on you, but cannot see you. Static, then silence. Howland Island was supposed to be there. Somewhere a dark line. In the water, a dot in the vastness. But the sea offered nothing. No shadow, no shape. Just shimmer. Her hands stayed steady. Always steady. She'd trained them to be. Trembling. Not even now, she thought, perhaps. Of the girl she once was, climbing into her first cockpit, wind in her hair, laughter in her throat. Of the applause, the headlines. The men who told her she couldn't, and the sky that told her otherwise. She thought of George, of his last letter, of how his hand had held hers at the edge of a crowd just before she left, saying nothing because there was too much to say. The sun had climbed higher. The heat pressed through the glass, sweat gathered behind her knees. Her breath slowed, and still she searched the sea. Her voice returned to the radio calm, certain, we are on the line. Then, nothing. No distress, no scream, no sound of failure, just a silence that stretched and stretched till it became part of the ocean itself. Somewhere far below, the waves kept moving. Gentle, vast, unconcerned. The plane did not return. The sky did not explain, and the world began to search in maps, in wreckage, in stories. But she was already gone, not lost, not broken, just gone. Like the final line of a poem spoken into wind. Amelia Earhart, not the symbol, not the mystery. Just a woman flying into the light, with the whole sky watching. And no one to see her fall. The street had grown heavy with heat. A dull, unrelenting warmth that soaked into the concrete and clung to the soles of every quiet step. The sky above Beijing was pale with haze, not the soft haze of morning, but the thick kind that came from smoke and breath and history burning slowly through the afternoon. And yet he did not move. He was not large, not tall, but he stood with a stillness that spread. The first tank slowed. The rumble eased into hesitation. Metal against concrete no longer thundered. It whispered. He lifted one hand, not clenched, just raised, as if to ask a question. The tank edged left. He stepped left. It edged right. He stepped again. A mirror. A dance. A refusal made without words. On the rooftops, cameras whirred. Shutters clicked. History startled, blinked once, and froze. The silence deepened. He leaned forward, said something. No one could hear it. The wind carried it away. But whatever he said, it was quiet. Soft enough to belong only to that moment. A soldier peeked from the hatch. Face, young and squinting, blinked down at the figure in the road. But the gun did not fire. Tank did not move. Behind it, the others waited, lined up like questions. Unanswered, and still, the man stood. His grocery bag hung at his side. He was not armed. He was not armored, only present, only human. The moment stretched impossibly long, till the spell of it nearly broke. Two men ran from the crowd. Civilian clothes. Their hands out, their voices urgent. They reached him, gently took his arms. Pulled him to the side. He did not resist. He turned once, glanced back at the tank. At the soldiers still watching, then let them lead him away. No, one knows what became of him. He did not return for applause. He did not seek legend. But the space where he had stood remained empty, wholly immobile. And to this day, when the footage plays, when the image reappears in silence, when someone whispers, "Look, he didn't run," the world remembers the man with the bag, not the rebel, not the hero, just a man who stood in the street, reminded history what stillness can do. The sea rolled slow and heavy around the base of the island, its waves curling against black rock with a rhythm older than memory. The cliffs rose like broken teeth from the water, sharp and wind-battered, their edges softened by moss and the distant cry of gulls. Above them, the lighthouse stood alone, a narrow tower of white stone and iron, its lantern room blinking gently through the fog. It had been days since anyone had heard from the Flannan Isles. The last log entry was brief, weather fine, barometer, steady duties done. Then silence. The relief ship approached slowly. The wind tugged at its sails. The men aboard leaned over the railing, eyes scanning the cliffs for movement, for color, for the familiar wave of a keeper's hand. But there was nothing, only the gray stone, only the slow flash of the light, still turning, still alive. But no one there to tend it. They climbed the narrow path from the landing. The air smelled of salt and damp wool. Grass clung to the hills in patches, yellowed from wind. Sheep stood in clusters, unmoving. The gate at the top of the path swung gently in the breeze, unlocked, unlacked. At the lighthouse door, they knocked once, then pushed it open. No sound inside. No greeting. The kitchen table was set for a meal, 2 chairs drawn out, 1 overturned. The teapot had long since cooled. Clock on the wall had stopped 3 days earlier. Boots sat beside the door, neatly placed. The oilskin coats were missing. They searched each room, the bunk beds made, the logbook open. The hearth cold, and above, in the lantern room, the lamp still turned. Slowly, faithfully, its glass smudged with sea spray, its flame kept alive by the mechanism below. But no hands had wound it in days. The wick had burned low. They descended in silence. Outside, the sky had darkened. Fog curled around the rocks, thickening like breath against the cliffs. The wind had changed. It carried something now. Not scent, not sound, but unease. 3 men had lived there, keepers of the light. Thomas Marshall, James Duquette, Donald MacArthur. No trace of them. No footprints in the soft earth. No torn fabric. No blood. Only absence. One theory said a storm took them. A rogue wave. Fierce and sudden. Another whispered of madness. One man lost to grief. Another to rescue. All 3. Gone. But none of that remained. Only the lighthouse. Still watching. Still blinking. Still remembering. They locked the door when they left. Not out of habit. Well, reverence. On the boat back, no one spoke. The tower shrank behind them, swallowed slowly by fog, its light pulsing faintly through the gray. Some nights, even now, sailors say the Flannan beacon flickers, even when it shouldn't, as if someone or something still climbs the spiral, stares, still polishes the lens, still waits. 3 men, lost without a sound, no storm recorded. No struggle found, just quiet in the light. Blinking, blinking, always blinking. A rhythm without breath, a memory without answer. The scent of parchment lingered in the air, rich and dry like the skin of something ancient. It clung to the marble columns and rose in thin curls from the candles that burned low in their brass holders. The floor beneath her feet was worn smooth, not by water, but by footsteps. Centuries of scholars tracing the same quiet paths between shelves, between scrolls, between stars. Outside, Alexandria breathed with unease. The air was heavy with the smoke of unrest, curling around the corners of the Serapeum, like fog that had forgotten how to rise. Voices drifted through the narrow streets, not in conversation, but in warning. Hypatia stood near a window, her robes gathered at her elbows. Her hands dusted with soot from a chalkboard she had long since set aside. Her fingers moved slowly along the edge of a scroll, one she had copied herself years ago. Her eyes didn't read. They remembered. Line after line, number after number, as if each stroke still lived behind her eyes. The library was quieter than usual. The scribes had not come that morning, nor had the students. Not since the whispers began that the crowd was forming. that someone had named her in the square, not as a philosopher, not as a teacher, but as something else, something dangerous she had not hidden. She would not. She moved through the chamber slowly, her sandals brushing against dust that hadn't yet been swept. Each scroll she touched, she knew by name. She had read them in moonlight, by oil lamp, through summers and storm seasons. They were not hers, but she had loved them like something alive outside the gates, feet gathered, not marching, gathering. Murmuring a low, rising hum, she turned to face the door, her pulse steady, her breath even. The crowd came before the sun reached its highest. They did not enter in silence. They tore the air open with voices, cries not of pain, but of heat, of fury. They pulled down the shelves, kicked through the archives, scrolls, scattered across the floor like fallen feathers, trampled underfoot. Fire came next, not by accident, by design. The dry reeds of history lit like straw, curling black and gold into the sky. She did not run. They took her in the street, dragged her through the sand. And ashed her robes tore, her skin bloodied, her voice silent. They did not allow her to speak. They did not want the words. They wanted to silence the shape of them. They beat her with tiles, the kind used to build temples. And as they struck her down, the past cracked too. She was not buried, not in earth, not in stone, only in ash dot when the fire died down in the library was nothing but smoke, nothing but heat. She was already gone, but her voice did not burn. Not really, it lingered. In quiet corners of science, in starlight traced by trembling fingers, in questions still asked beneath candlelight, Hypatia of Alexandria, not the martyr, not the heretic, just a woman who loved to learn, who stood still among flames, and whispered, the last word before the world caught fire. The concrete was cold beneath her fingers, rough, uneven, covered in old paint. Faded slogans, chipped colors that once shouted and now only whispered. She pressed her hand to the wall and closed her eyes, feeling its surface as if it might still remember. The night air carried the weight of something changing. It's a kind of weight that doesn't roar, that hums, that trembles low in the belly, like thunder too far away to see, but close enough to feel. All along the eastern side, people had gathered. It's quiet at first, then louder, then still again. Not a protest. Celebration. Something else. They glowed dull and tired, barely cutting through the mist. The guards in the towers had stopped shouting, their rifles still slung, but lowered now, their eyes no longer hard, only confused, afraid, perhaps. Unsure, on the western side, music, laughter, a strange sort of reverence, not for the wall itself, but for the idea that it might not last the night. And in between that narrow strip of silence, she stood at the edge of it, her coat wrapped tight, her breath rising visibly in the November air. Her brother had crossed years ago, or tried to. She never knew for sure. The letters had stopped. The photographs disappeared. Only the silence remained. Silence that had lived here for decades, built into the bricks, sewn into the barbed wire. But tonight, something was different. Someone had climbed it first. A boy, shirt half untucked, holding nothing but a flashlight. Then another, a girl with torn gloves. They straddled the top, laughing, not wildly, but carefully, disbelieving, like children finding the attic unlocked for the first time, and then hands, from both sides, reaching, not over, but through. Cracks had opened. Holes chipped slowly by hammer and stone, not just by force, but by hope. She stepped forward, not rushed, not dramatic, just forward. She reached out. Her fingers brushed cool concrete, then something else warmer, a hand. From the other side, they didn't speak. There was no need. For years they had been told what could not be done, where they could not walk, who they could not hold. And now, in the dark beneath, a sky just beginning to clear, they touched just once, and in that touch, the wall gave a little. Not with a crack, but with a sigh, because walls are built with hands, and taken down the same way, by hands, by breath. By touch, the chisels came later, the chance, the flood of light. But first, it was quiet, it was human, it was her hand on cold concrete, and his hand reaching back. The wall stood for a few more hours, a softness the world had forgotten. The trench was silent now, the earth softened by rain, dark with the weight of history and mud. There had been no more gunfire for hours, only the distant thunder of artillery, which seemed to carry on forever, as if the war itself were not over yet. Not really. The air was thick with wet earth and sweat, with blood and exhaustion. Uniform clung to his frame, soaked through, heavy with the weight of too many days spent crouching in the dark. He sat against the side of the trench, his rifle leaning against his shoulder. His hands were raw from holding it, from the endless waiting and the endless fighting. But now, in the quiet that had slipped into the night like a thief, there was no fight, only silence. He looked down at the ground, watching the mud pool around his boots. Somewhere beyond the trench, the stars were dimly visible through a broken sky, as if the heavens themselves were afraid to shine too brightly. The world was lost between the night and the fog, and in the stillness, he could almost believe that he had been here forever. His comrades had fallen around him, but he remained. Not because he had chosen to, but because survival often has no reason, no rhyme. The battlefield, in its own cruel way, had grown accustomed to him. It had become part of the landscape now, part of the cycle of destruction and rebirth that had taken root in this scarred earth. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, his breath fogging the air in front of him. He tried not to think about the war, about the months of waiting and fighting. He tried not to remember the faces of those who had fallen beside him, the ones who had whispered their last words in the dark, just before the world swallowed them. Oh, but tonight his mind could not let go. It clung to the sound of the wind and the drip of water from the trees above, the creak of the trees themselves swaying gently in the breeze. There was a faint smell of pine even here in the middle of the battlefield, and for a moment he could almost convince himself that he was back home, that he was not a soldier, not part of the machine of war, but a man sitting on a bench outside his house, beneath a sky that did not scream or burn. The thought passed, and he was back here again. The soldier, alone in the trench. The night felt heavier than usual, as if it were carrying something he could not yet understand. Perhaps it was the weight of the war itself, a war that stretched for too long and consumed too many. Or perhaps it was just the weight of the world, pushing down until it was impossible to see anything beyond the walls of his own thoughts. The ground beneath him shifted slightly, as if something had moved in the earth, and he felt a strange pang in his chest. Something was changing. Not just the battlefield, but the world itself. The war would end. It had to. It was all they had heard in the whispers and the rumors. The generals would make peace. The politicians would sign treaties. The guns would fall silent. But for now, there was only the soft thrum of his pulse, the ache in his limbs, and the quiet that had spread like a blanket over the trench. The world, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, was still. And he breathed. The wind tugged at the edges of his coat, as if trying to pull him into the future, into whatever might come next. He had lived through so much. He had seen the worst of humanity, watched as men lost themselves to madness, to violence, to the dark side of the soul. But now, in the quiet, he could almost believe that there was a chance to leave it all behind. To walk away from the war, from the endless fighting, and find something that was whole. It was a thought that flickered in the back of his mind, fleeting like a candle that might die out at any moment. He would not survive this war, he knew. The trenches had claimed too many, and now they were slowly claiming him as well. His wounds, though they had not yet killed him, were signs that he would not leave this place unscathed. He was just another soldier waiting for the end. But tonight, there was no gunfire. There was only silence. He closed his eyes just for a moment, and the world softened around him. The battle, the pain, the fear, it all drifted away. He could almost hear the voices of his family, calling him back. He could hear his mother's laughter, his sister's footsteps in the hall. He could almost smell the warm bread baking in the kitchen. For a brief second, he was no longer here. No longer a soldier in a trench, but the moment passed. The night deepened, and the stars above became clearer. A faint light shimmered in the distance, the promise of dawn, and for the first time in so long he felt something that could almost be called peace. He rested his head against the cold earth, the rifle still clutched in his hand. It was the last battle he would fight, not against an enemy, but against time itself. He had survived so much, but there was no surviving the quiet that was coming. The last breath of the soldier would never be recorded in any history book. His name would not be remembered by those who fought for the same cause. He was just another face, another body in the mud. But tonight, in the soft, suffocating silence of the battlefield, he did not need to be remembered. He simply needed to rest. And when the sun finally rose, it would find him still. His body surrendered to the earth, his breath no longer a part of the war, just another soldier, lost but not forgotten. The ash had fallen for hours. At first it came gently like dust, shaken from the shoulders of the sky, a soft gray veil that drifted through courtyards and over rooftops, coating figs left on tables, gathering in the folds of curtains left open to the breeze. It did not frighten anyone at first. It was only dust, they said. Just the mountains speaking. Child lay curled in a blanket in the corner of the villa's atrium, small limbs tucked beneath a linen wrap, one thumb resting lightly near her cheek. The heat of the day had faded, and the tiles beneath her felt cool, smooth against her skin. She stirred slightly, her breath catching now and then as children do when their dreams shift. Her mother had set her there to nap while she swept the hallway. A loaf of bread cooled nearby on a clay plate, and water rested untouched in a copper bowl. There had been voices earlier, men shouting in the street, sandals scuffing the stone, someone calling from a rooftop, but it all sounded far away now, muted. The mountain loomed above Pompeii, as it always had, familiar, immovable. And then, it wasn't. The rumble had started in the earth, low and long, a sound that seemed to come from beneath the soles of the feet. It shook vases from their shelves, cracked the stone basins, sent pigeons flurrying into the sky with wings frantic and wide. The mother had screamed once, name, the child's name, but the child did not wake, not through the trembling, not through the falling of light from the walls as windows shattered, not through the rush of neighbors down the street, hands over their mouths, carrying whatever they could grab, candles, keys, small statues of household gods. The villa cracked somewhere. Deep within its bones, the ash came thicker now, choking, endless, poured through doorways, pushed beneath thresholds, piled like snow across the floor. But the child still breathed. The room had darkened. The daylight swallowed. The sky above no longer blue, but a dense grey-black, pressed tight against the ceiling of the world. Somewhere, a dog howled once, and then only the fall of ash. A sound like paper tearing endlessly. He coughed once, the sound soft, muffled in his throat. The candle wavered in sympathy. His eyes opened halfway, not in pain, not in fear, but in memory. He looked to the wallpaper and smiled. "It's killing me," he said. The joke was weak, barely a breath. It shimmered in the still air, like perfume from a letter kept too long in a drawer. And then it vanished. He blinked once, not for sleep, for something slower. He had known beauty in all its forms, and suffered for each of them. He had been exiled, adored, despised, and remembered too soon. The world had crushed him under its judgment, and still, he found wit in the dark. The door creaked once in the hall, then stopped. He was alone. He had chosen it. The room did not protest. The candle leaned lower, its flame no longer sharp. He turned his face back to the ceiling, watched the plaster curve above him like the edge of a shell or a stage. A final act. Without applause, he did. Not speak again, only breathed, and then stopped. The room did not sigh. It did not mourn. It simply grew still. Oscar Wilde, not the playwright, not the prisoner, just a man in a quiet room, who saw the world's cruelty and still chose to laugh. The sky above the Atlantic was the clearest it had ever been. a dark canvas strewn with stars so sharp and still they seemed stitched into the night. There was no moon, only that infinite ceiling above the water, and the hush that came after awe. The sea itself was calm, unmoving, as if holding its breath. No waves, no wind, just that deep black mirror stretching in every direction. And above it the ship, massive, elegant, unbelieving, Titanic. She had been the pride of two nations, floating palaces, brass and linen, white-gloved service, laughter and violins that never stopped playing. Till now. Now, the decks were quieter, slower, shadows moving against lantern light, footsteps faster than they had been an hour before. Not yet panic. Just the echo of questions too softly spoken. She stood near the rail, her shawl pulled tight against her shoulders, the cold already finding its way through the lace. Her hair was pinned neat. Her gloves held no purse, no fan, only a folded note, one she'd meant to send before dinner. Now it felt like a relic from another life. The lifeboats were being uncovered, ropes pulled, voices rising. The word precaution had been used, and yet the air had changed. She glanced down. The water shimmered so far below, smooth, endless, beautiful, in a way that made her feel small. Somewhere behind her, a steward called for women and children. His voice was polite, controlled, but thinner now. Not quite hiding the tremor, she turned. Others were boarding, mothers holding children wrapped in coats. Elderly couples stepping in without a word. Some laughed nervously, as if pretending. Others cried softly, faces turned away from the light, and still the music played. A quartet on deck, soft, steady, a waltz at first. Then something slower, something that didn't belong in disaster, but they played, as if it mattered. She watched the musicians for a long moment, then turned back to the rail. The ship shuddered once beneath her, barely more than a sigh, but she felt it in her spine. A man passed by, offering a place in the next boat. She shook her head, thanked him, stayed. The tilt was more obvious now. Glasses slid from tables in the dining room below. Chairs drifted toward walls. And still the sea remained calm. People were praying, quietly, alone. Some wept. The bow dipped lower. The sky, still perfectly clear, looked down without expression. Another lifeboat launched. It splashed faintly, then floated outward, into darkness. She closed her eyes and listened to the music, to the groaning of steel, to her own breath. The last lights flickered once, then held, then failed. The tilt steepened. The stern began to rise, and then a sound, not of screams, not of panic. A groan, a tearing. Like the bones of the earth opening, the ship broke, not with fire, but with a deep, sorrowful snap. The deck beneath her feet lifted. She held the rail tighter, not in fear, but in surrender. The sea rose. She did not fight it. When the cold came, it was not sudden, it was total. Like sleep, like stone. The water claimed the decks. The lifeboats drifted farther. Stars remained, and Titanic slipped beneath them, whole in memory. Shattered in silence, she was one of over 1,000, but she was not. Forgotten not by the sea, not by the sky, not by the music that was played until the final note. She went down with grace, not as a victim, but as a witness, to the quiet end of something. Too large to save, and too beautiful to forget. The walls were bare, except for the cracks that time had pressed into their surface. Thin, pale lines like veins under skin. The floor was rough cement, cold even in the summer months. One narrow window, high and square, allowed a slice of sky into the cell. Sometimes blue, sometimes gray, but mostly forgotten. Robben Island held its breath around him. The sea beyond the stone perimeter whispered through iron bars, but it never called his name. The salt air could not carry freedom, only memory. Nelson Mandela sat on the edge of a rolled mat, his back straight, his hands resting in his lap. He wore the same faded uniform he had worn the day before and the day before, that a light blue shirt, sleeves rolled. His fingers were stained with dust and ink from crushed rocks and careful letters. The days passed slowly here, each one folded into the next, so that time became its own kind of silence. Silence that did not ask, but endured. He had not spoken. Aloud in hours, there was no need. He had learned long ago that words mattered more when they waited on the far side of the cell. A metal bucket, a single blanket, a small desk, a cup, a Bible. That was all, and yet the room held more than it appeared. It held the shape of a mind that refused to bend, the weight of ideas too large for four walls, the quiet certainty of a man who had chosen the long road and still chose it every morning. He rose slowly, stretched his arms with care. The joints ached more now. His face was lined, not from defeat, but from keeping his eyes open for so long. Outside, footsteps passed, guards in, their patterns. The door did not open, but he did not need it to, because freedom had come to mean something different in here. It was not space or sky or movement. It was the ability to hold on to truth, to patience, to dignity. He stepped to the window. The sun cut across his face, warm for a moment, then gone. Beyond it, Cape Town shimmered faintly, so close, so far. He remembered laughter. He remembered speeches. But he remembered silence most of all, the silence of hunger, of waiting, of believing when the world no longer did. A dove passed the window once. White wings quick and careless. He smiled. The guards would not see it, but the cell did. The wall behind him had heard every breath, every whisper, every prayer beneath his breath. And it would remember this one too, the breath that came, slow and steady, the one before release, the one before return. He did not know the date they would set him free, but he knew it would come. Not in anger, not in vengeance, only in time. And when it did, he would walk softly from the gate, blinking into a sky that no longer forgot his name, Nelson Mandela. Not the prisoner, not the rebel, just the man in the cell, who waited through winter after winter, never let go of spring. The tomb was sealed tight beneath the sand, its doorway lost behind layers of time and stone and silence. No wind touched it, no footsteps stirred above, just the slow drift of desert dust, fine as ash, falling grain by grain through a world that no longer remembered the boy who slept within. For over 3,000 years, it had waited, not forgotten, not discovered, only untouched. In the darkness beyond the threshold, the air held a stillness so perfect it felt sacred, silence thick with breath never taken, with words never spoken. The chamber smelled of old linen and warm gold, of resin, and myrrh that had not faded. Even in death, the fragrance lingered, soft, rich, eternal. Tutankhamun lay at the heart of it all, not the myth, not the legend. Only the boy, his body wrapped in layer upon layer of linen, the fabric browned with age, crumbling at the edges like parchment. His arms folded across his chest, fingers curled gently beneath amulets and charm. His face hidden beneath the mask, that gleaming, eternal mask, blue and gold, and impossibly still. He had been young, too young. A king barely crowned before the earth took him back. No war, no triumph. It's just a sudden end in the hush of a palace he never truly ruled.
His
name had been buried with him, scratched from the stone walls of temples, erased by those who followed. But the tomb remembered. The carvings on the wall still whispered his titles, his journey through the stars. The gods who greeted him in the dark. The canopic jars lined the chamber like mourners who had never left. Statues stood in eternal vigil, eyes painted wide, watching for breath that would not return. And in the center, the sarcophagus, resting in its golden shrine, silent as a heartbeat once held too long. When the seal was finally broken, it did not scream, it sighed. The dust lifted gently, rising like incense. Curling into the light of the torch, the archaeologist stepped inside, his breath sharp, chest tight. He reached forward with a trembling hand, and the candle flame flickered once in the still air. "Can you see anything?" Someone whispered behind him. He did not answer right away. He only stood, eyes wide, voice hushed. "Yes, wonderful things. Yet, the most wonderful thing was not the gold, not the jewelry, not the ancient magic coiled around the boy's limbs. It was the quiet. The quiet of a life paused, was perfectly preserved. The quiet of a breath that had waited 30 centuries to exhale. Tunchno. Not the ruler of empires, not the ghost in stories, just the child beneath the mask, wrapped in linen, watched by gods, and held by time. The Tigris moved slowly that morning, its waters darkened by ash, by ink, by pieces of parchment that floated like lost feathers across the surface. The sun rose pale behind the smoke, casting a gray shimmer over the domes and courtyards of a city that had once whispered to the world through scholars and calligraphers, through poets and astronomers, and now said nothing at all. The House of Wisdom stood quiet, or what was left of it. The roof had caved in days ago. Flames had traced the beams like vines, climbing through rafters, wrapping around shelves, leaping from manuscript to manuscript until there was nothing left but smoke. Scrolls had curled in the heat, blackened and folded, their letters rising like breath into the air before disappearing forever. Pages once inked by hand, each stroke precise, sacred, now drifted into nothing. A man stood in the rubble. His hands, once used to turn pages, now shook with soot. His robes were singed at the hem, the edge of a sash clinging to the embers. He held nothing. There was nothing left to hold. Behind him a wall still smoldered. On it, the faintest traces of a diagram, planets, perhaps, or lines of thought once debated beneath candlelight. But it would not last. Even the stone here seemed ready to give in. He stepped forward. The floor cracked under his feet. He had read here every day for years. Between the columns, near the window with the morning light, he remembered the hum of debate, the laughter between verses of Rumi, the rustle of parchment pulled carefully from shelves. There had been a rhythm to the House of Wisdom. It lived, breathed, held the thoughts of the world, and now it was gone. Not with the scream of battle, not with siege engines or shattered gates, but with silence. The scholars had tried to carry what they could, their arms full of books, their satchels stretched wide, but fire is quicker than hands, quicker than hope. And the river had taken the rest. They said the water ran black for days, that the ink of 1,000 manuscripts had poured into the Tigris, staining it darker than night. That even the fish swam crooked, confused by the knowledge spilled into their world. He sat down slowly on a fragment of scorched marble and wept. Not for himself, not for his city, but for the silence to come. The silence that arrives when memory burns. There would be no archive to piece back together, no catalog to rebuild, only memory. And those who carried it, quietly, alone. The ashes stirred in the wind, lifting into spirals above the broken dome. Somewhere a single page drifted across the courtyard, its edges glowing. A passage from a poem, perhaps a formula, perhaps the name of a forgotten star. Then gone. The House of Wisdom not. Just a library, not just a place, but the breath between civilizations. And on that morning in Baghdad, the world forgot how to breathe. The night is slow now. The wind is faded. The world lies still, as though the breath it held through all these stories is finally exhaled. There is no clock in this room, no ticking, no bell to mark the hour. Just the hush of something settling, a memory curling down like smoke, like a blanket, like time choosing where to rest. All the endings we've wandered through, the names, the lives, the last moments, they do not rise with fanfare, do not roar. They pass like leaves falling through water, quiet, whole, never lost. They lived once, briefly, wonderfully, awfully, tenderly, a queen at dawn. A child beneath the ash, a man in front of a tank, a monk with one last line, a servant in the snow, composer turning toward silence. Each death was its own sky, each ending its own breath. But beneath them all, something remained, not their power, not their titles, their stillness, Because death does not end stories, it preserves them. In the way a room remembers footsteps long after they've faded, in the way a candle's warmth clings to the wax after the flame is gone. And now, we've reached the last doorway. It doesn't open with a creak. It doesn't shine. It waits. Gently. There's nothing more to see. No curtain to lift. No great secret hidden in the final act. Just the softness of knowing you've heard what was whispered, that you've listened long enough to forget where. Your own breathing stopped, and theirs began. Outside this story, the world is quiet too. The stars above haven't moved. The room around you is still. Let it stay that way. Let the names drift. Let the faces blur, not from forgetting, but from remembering them too, deeply to hold on to. Their last breaths are yours now, held in the stillness between your ribs, and when you sleep, which you must be. Almost now they'll sleep with you, because in the hush of endings, death cannot touch. It's the part of us that listens, the part that remembers, the part that still waits in silence.